it's so amazing to be here with Pat. Pat is somebody that I knew before I started in this field because she was already a legend in the 70s, actually, as a very young person. She was already doing incredible work in this field, so thank you for everything over all the years. And I thought I'd start by diversifying the geographical location of people that are speaking here today. We had so many people from Ohio yesterday that I thought I would really go out on a limb and let you know that I'm from Kansas. So just so you know, we're really broadening it out here. And I told somebody that, and they said, it doesn't make any difference. It's all like flyover. I was like, no. Wait till you hear from us Midwesterners. So good morning. Happy Saturday. Katie tried to sell me on the notion that the 9:15 Saturday morning slot is a choice slot. But we know that there's only one worse, and that's Sunday morning at 9:15, so I'm here to make it worth your while. There, okay, great. So how does it feel to be among the most connected, invigorated, motivated, intelligent Homo sapiens on the planet? Because that's who you are, I know most of you, and that's who you are. And yes, I have been reading Harari's books. 2 million years of DNA went into you, and you chose to be here on March 2nd, 2019. And fun fact, as I was researching this particular slide, there is actually no slide that I could find that shows the history of humankind with a lady body. So I named the date because we know that the days of human counting may be more numbered than we originally thought, so I make it a practice to recognize each day as it passes. Here we are in Washington, D.C., the epicenter of a global experiment in democracy, the home of a national narrative, the place where the politics are carried out of what one Chinese politician has called a shooting star in history. And that shooting star he referred to is, of course, democracy itself. So I'll pause while you take that in. We acknowledge again today that we are gathered here on land formerly settled by many tribes, including the Nikichtak, an Algonquian-speaking tribe that actually oversaw a central trading hub here on the East Coast of many tribes. This was their center, and they largely succumbed to European disease by the mid-1600s because they had no immunity. We have noted over time here that the world around us is in various forms of crisis. This slide shows democracy in retreat based on the loss of civic space and civil rights. This is a slide from the Freedom House report, which shows the various stages of freedom enjoyed in countries of the world, ranging from closed, repressed, obstructed, narrowed, and open. And for each country and territory, Freedom in the World analyzes the electoral process, political pluralism and participation, the functioning of the government, freedom of expression and belief, associational and organizational rights, the rule of law, and personal autonomy and individual rights. And so you can see the colors are changing in ways that we would not necessarily wish for. Inequality is rampant. Yesterday we heard so many stories about the populations most affected. Truth is fiction, fantasy is real, especially under this administration. I believe this has given rise to a new ecosystem for progressives that is focused on the science and art of narrative strategies that reflect justice and dignity, and I think that is the organizing principle of why we're all here today and why I believe there was such a response to coming to this conference. Extractive capitalism is finally being critiqued in mainstream society, but remains largely unchecked. Climate insecurity is upon us. We can no longer depend on the weather. Living systems are under threat and already dying and in decline, and the situation is critical. In fact, it's time to panic, according to the New York Times. A paper of international record affirms that fear in the face of all of this is perhaps the most reasonable response to what's happening. And many of us already know the situation is dire, and that's why we're working in the ways that we're working. While many people are realizing the enormity of the challenges and the scale of the solution, change is slow until it's not. Consider the rise of the Green New Deal on the wave of a shock victory in Queens by a young representative, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Built on 2 decades of discussions about what a green energy transition would look like, Ocasio-Cortez was ready in the moment with a Green New Deal when the balance suddenly shifted. And what I want to do here is offer a vision of another way to tackle the times that we are in that doesn't rest in panic, which is really the root feeling of what so many of us are dealing with. It starts in this room and others like it, and being ready for the long fight and for the moment that things move fast, because the balance of power has shifted just enough to create an epic opening. I'm reminded of Toni Morrison's ideas in this regard. In her most recent book, The Source of Self-Regard, she says this about another response to chaos. There are 2 human responses to the perception of chaos, she says, naming and violence. There is, however, a 3rd response to chaos, which I have not heard about, which is stillness. Such stillness can be passivity and dumbfoundedness that, like, what? That so many of us feel every day as we hear about news from Washington, D.C. It can be paralytic fear, but it can also be art. In this idea are the keys of what I think will be the defining force of the future, and it is the present and future I hold in mind. I'll call this the mindset for change. But before we move on, I want to explain these images that you've been seeing. I wanted to experience something beautiful this morning, and you may or may not think it's beautiful, but I think these images are quite provocative. This is from a show at the Guggenheim. It's one of the only public presentations of a Swedish artist named Hilma af Klint. She was working between 1906 and 1915, and she created a towering series of paintings. These paintings are 20 feet tall when you see them in the Guggenheim, and she called them the paintings for the temple, or the Great Commission. She spent 5 years working alone and listening to what she said were spiritual forces in her studio, and at the end of that time, she had transformed her art from the most competent and skilled of naturalist painters to the inventor of an entirely new conceptual grammar that presaged modernism. She called it radical abstraction, and she stipulated that her work would not be shown publicly for 20 years after she died, not after she made it, because she thought the world was not ready to receive it. She quietly broke all of the rules of painting to date and invented a new grammar of expression. She was transformative and guided by an inner conviction, and she affected the flow of modernism, though this was not discovered until 1986. And so the history of painting is now being rewritten because of the showing and the discovery and the real analysis of the work that she did. And I tell this story because we as people dedicated to creating new knowledge are a bit like Hilma. We see beyond the horizon to a future that isn't here yet, but is still in some way knowable because we help to create it through our imaginations and our stories. We are working on paradigm shifts, not tinkering and making the status quo more palatable. Many of the stories we heard yesterday are part of this story, so I want you to keep those details in mind as I take you through some of the experiments that I've been a part of with many of you, working side by side in designing systems that support numerous efforts across multiple fields, including many stakeholders who are trying to build common ground. And in many ways, it's an attempt at creating a network that's doing this work so we can all do it better and faster. In our communities, I believe we have examples all around us of people who are breaking old molds and creating new ways of understanding how to build power, create and implement new models of collaboration, and it centers in that stillness that the artistic experience can elicit. So I want to ask you to imagine, what if we treated artists as powerful leaders in communities? What if we actually treated artists that way? Starting with the creators is something that I've always held in my practice, and it's a piece of a larger whole, but starting with creators is just one starting place in designing the networks that I believe will ultimately lead to the systems change that we're looking for. If we did, creators would not simply have a seat at the table. I'm reminded of Rashad Robinson's phrase, "Let us not mistake presence for power." Rather, they would design the tables and invite the others. They would not be lionized, alienated, or diminished as Western societies treat artists and storytellers, or housed in separate facilities like museums and performance halls. Their processes would be threaded through everyday life. They would not let us forget that play, not performance, is the evolutionary force. They would not have allowed society to move STEAM and reduce it to STEM in our educational systems. There's a footnote there later I can explain to you for those that don't know STEAM and STEM. They would strengthen our minds to create an experience in equal measure to training many of us to solve for data-based solutions through our professions. And most importantly, participating regularly in creative processes would equip communities to identify the real threats to well-being in community and come together to repel that threat. In other words, they would become a community's first line of defense to recognize long-term interests, not short-term games. It would be harder to fool us. Here are the attributes of the kinds of grantees that I think best reflect a social justice approach that can tackle the challenges we face. They are literally rooted in community. They propose imagined communities. They envision future communities. They do the work of healing in communities. They restore history and identity in community. They have a creative practice that is tied to the right of the land, a creative practice that demands a right to your story, a creative practice that leaves benefits behind in communities like leadership, funds, increased trust, technology, cohesion, acts of truth, and reconciliation. So creating a lasting and powerful collaboration and partnership model that will move people through the extreme conditions we are seeing and which will increase towards a new society we must build. It is not transactional, extractive, authoritative, and prescriptive. Rather, we have to fund with foresight and hitch our metrics and our evaluation to investing in practices that result in these qualities: trust, shared experience, rigor, the gift of time to build all these things, solidarity, shared vision, aligned values, and finally, love, which is what justice looks like when it's in public, as Cornel West has said. So I want to show you some examples of these transformative, of some transformative grantees that Just Films has seeded and supported. And I also want to say that Just Films exists in a larger ecosystem. MacArthur has been here for many, many decades as well, particularly in the United States. And we hope that others join in force in this arena. So the Detroit Narrative Agency. This is a new kind of social justice cinema hub based in Detroit, defined by reciprocity and mutual well-being, and built on a generation of activists, artists, organizers. And this is one person: activist, artist, organizer. And there are many of them in Detroit because of the legacy of Grace Lee Boggs and many more who infused commitment to community benefit throughout their work. Good Pitch is Doc Society's signature community event and documentary training for a program defined by radical recognition of each other's deep humanity, and it is being adopted around the world. This is a very complicated slide, but just believe it's everywhere all the time over the next few years. And this is something that I believe is really a groundbreaking and transformative force, and it's something that we've been able to thread through every office and every program at Ford Foundation, not because we think it's right, but because the people that are working in the regions around the world think it's right. And Beatty Finzi is here, and Tricia Finneran is here, and I've been very privileged to work with them over the last decade building this model. Some individuals. Here's Ramel Ross, who just came off of an Academy Award campaign for his film, Hale County, this evening. He speaks of recentering the black gaze to make story that is both his and the community that he spent 5 years in Alabama near Greensboro. And he draws his audience in through a reimagined cinematic grammar that makes a co-creation in the viewing of that film. It's quite extraordinary. Thomas Allen Harris, who has evolved a single film into a community-based event, into a template for a national public television series called Family Pictures USA, which brings communities together through sharing family histories and family stories. It's hugely transformative. It brings people together across difference through every kind of community and knits them in a space of 2 hours. It's absolutely the antidote to division. Nancy Schwartzman, you heard from yesterday. She is recentering the narrative away from the victim and onto the community in a way that sustains, a community that sustains the conditions for violence and abuse to continue. And her recentering is an intervention in that narrative and a model for all of us. So some thoughts on why we do this, or why at least we've tried to do this while I've been at Ford Foundation, is to develop structural competence. I'm borrowing that phrase, Courtney's phrase from yesterday. The ability to frame things in terms of structures, cultures, and systems. This is a skill that we do not have, that I believe we're building in the kinds of collaborations and the work that we're doing. The second thing is to have tools to diagnose the real threats and long-term solutions, mobilize communities around them, and advance them. The third thing, to provide new pathways to authentic experience. If you know it, you don't fear it. And finally, to reduce or eliminate the gap between being invisibilized, being seen, and being heard. Many millions of people are speaking their truths about today's crucial issues, but they're not being heard. And they won't be heard without the structures and approaches that partners in alignment to working together to raise up story rooted in authentic experience and tempered by the creative bring. So I'll close with an experiment and a video that many of us are implementing at Just Films. This is the creation of a global network of regionally based, globally minded organizations, all serving transformative nonfiction filmmakers. This was launched last year as a 5-year project, and it is funded by Ford Foundation right now through 2021. You can see the notion is a circulation of ideas and projects, films, creative content in a world where bodies cannot circulate. We believe that circulating their ideas is a very, very powerful option. So here are the organizations. I know it's a lot of information, but you can recognize who they are. In the US, they're ITVS, Firelight, Sundance, and Tribeca. In the UK, they're Doc Society. Also in the US, we have IDFA, and we have a string of Global South organizations that have been built up over the last 10 years that are coming together now in a Global South network of exchange, resource building, knowledge exchange, and really kind of creating a safety net for these voices and visions as we move forward into a world with even greater challenges. So this may seem like a drop in a global bucket, but our voices are more powerful than I think we give ourselves credit for, and when joined, I believe are a pillar of the transformation we seek. One more note, and we'll play the video and move on to the next set of incredible speakers. I've been following the work of Dutch historian Rutger Bregman. How many people have seen or heard of his work? So he's a 30-year-old wonderkind who has written about universal basic income, among many other things. And he's flash famous today for a kind of double header that he did. He spoke at Davos recently in January about taxes and the billionaire class. And then Tucker Carlson invited him on Tucker Carlson to sort of cheer with glee about this, and he totally took down Tucker Carlson for being part of the billionaire class. And both these videos are online. They're about 10 minutes long, and I encourage you to watch them. And in today's Times profile of his work, he said, you know, it's pretty clear that 30 years from now, things will be considered common sense that right now seem pretty bizarre. I'm not sure that history will move in the right direction, but I'm doing my best to contribute. So thank you. Let's play the video.
I don't go out with no weapons or nothing like that. I go out with my camera. That's my weapon.
Large-scale, widespread abuses, killings, torture, arbitrary detentions, denial of medical assistance.
It really doesn't matter whether you're talking about the oppressed or the oppressor. An oppressive society will dehumanize and degenerate everyone involved.
My son was not armed, not violent, not aggressing. In no way is his death justifiable.
I ask only that you ensure this information makes it home to the American public. Thank you, and be careful. Citizen 4.
So happy to get to put this in front of you, and I invite you to take it as seriously as we did, because at the end of the day, these are people's real lives. This is nonfiction.
I'm always trying to figure out how I fit in the world, which I think is something that I share with 7 billion other people.
Moment pour nous prendre conscience de tout ça n'a pas duré, parce que tout le monde c'est monde.
I'm here to tell you that we refuse to give up hope.